The flight that changed everything. Aria Thompson adjusted her blazer, a subtle sign of the confidence she carried with her everywhere. At 35, she had worked tirelessly to rise through the ranks of corporate law, her name etched on the firm's cornerstone as one of its youngest partners. Now she was on her way to Los Angeles for a groundbreaking legal summit, where she would deliver a keynote speech on corporate ethics. Her first-class ticket was more than a seat. It was a testament to years of sacrifice and determination. As she stepped into the luxury of the aircraft's first-class cabin, Aria took a moment to appreciate the plush leather seats and the soft hum of exclusivity. Yet, a small voice in her mind reminded her not to get too comfortable. Experience had taught her that even in spaces she'd rightfully earned, her presence could provoke discomfort in others. Aria brushed off the thought, smiling politely at the passengers already seated. Her seat was beside the window, a prime spot she had chosen deliberately to enjoy a moment of solitude. Placing her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment, she adjusted her silk scarf, a vibrant splash of orange against her navy suit. Just as she settled in, the flight attendant appeared. She was a woman in her late 40s with a no-nonsense expression that Aria instantly recognized as a potential challenge. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said sharply. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Aria looked up, a hint of surprise flickering in her eyes. "Of course," she replied, handing over the ticket. Her movements were measured, her expression calm. She had learned to meet scrutiny with poise, knowing that any reaction could be misinterpreted. The flight attendant examined the pass, her brow furrowing. "I'll need to verify this," she muttered, walking away without further explanation. Aria watched her retreat, a knot forming in her stomach. Around her, the hum of casual conversations faded into a pointed silence as passengers turned to observe. Minutes later, the flight attendant returned with the lead crew member, a man with a clipboard and a stiff demeanor. "Miss Thompson," he began, "we're having some concerns about your ticket. Could you step aside so we can clarify a few things?" Aria's heart sank, but she maintained her composure. "I assure you my ticket is valid. I purchased it directly from your airline weeks ago," she said, her voice steady but firm. "If there's an issue, I'd like to address it here." The lead attendant's eyes darted to the other passengers, some of whom were now openly watching the interaction. "This isn't the place for a discussion," he insisted. "Please come with us." Aria hesitated, feeling the weight of their gazes. She wasn't just being questioned, she was being put on display. Despite her calm exterior, a storm of emotions churned inside her: humiliation, frustration, and a deep-seated anger at the familiar sting of being judged not by her accomplishments, but by her appearance. "I'm happy to cooperate," Aria replied. Her tone clipped. "But I'd like to know why my ticket is being questioned." Her words were met with silence, their implication hanging heavy in the air. She wasn't mistaken about what was happening. This wasn't about a ticket. It was about her. Before the crew could respond, a man seated a row ahead stood up. "Excuse me," he interjected, his deep voice carrying across the cabin. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair and the polished look of someone used to commanding attention. "What exactly is the issue here?" The lead attendant shifted uncomfortably. "This is a private matter, sir." "Doesn't seem very private," the man retorted, glancing around at the curious onlookers. "You've made it everyone's business by treating this woman like a criminal. I'm Mark Reynolds, and I've flown this route countless times. I've never seen a situation like this handled so publicly. Care to explain why she's being singled out?" Aria looked at Mark, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. His intervention wasn't just unexpected, it was powerful. Around them, murmurs of agreement began to ripple through the cabin. The flight crew exchanged uneasy glances. "We're just following protocol," the lead attendant said defensively. "Well, your protocol stinks," Mark shot back. "And it's discriminatory. Unless you have solid evidence that this woman's ticket is fraudulent, I suggest you let her take her seat and stop embarrassing yourselves." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Aria felt a surge of hope as Mark's words shifted the dynamic. For the first time, The flight crew seemed to falter. But just as she thought the ordeal might end, a new figure approached. The airline's regional manager, summoned to the scene after complaints from passengers. The manager, a woman in a crisp uniform, addressed Aria directly. "Miss Thompson, we apologize for any inconvenience. We just need to verify your information. If you'd allow us to escort you." "No," Aria interrupted, her voice firm. "You can verify everything right here. I have my ID, my receipt, and my confirmation email. There's no need to move anywhere." The manager hesitated, caught off guard by Aria's calm but resolute demeanor. "Very well," she conceded. Aria handed over her documents, her fingers steady despite the anger simmering beneath her skin. The manager reviewed them, her expression growing increasingly uncomfortable as she realized there was no issue. After a tense few minutes, she returned the documents with a forced smile. "Everything checks out. Please accept our apologies." Aria met her gaze evenly. "Your apology doesn't erase the humiliation I just experienced. This isn't about a misunderstanding. This is about systemic bias, and I'm not letting it go." Mark stepped forward, his presence commanding. "She's right," he said, "and I'll be ensuring this incident doesn't disappear quietly. Consider yourselves warned." The crew members avoided eye contact as Aria returned to her seat. The murmurs in the cabin had grown louder, passengers voicing their disapproval of the airline's handling of the situation. Aria, though rattled, felt a newfound resolve. This wasn't just about her ticket. It was about confronting a system that perpetuated injustice. As the plane began its taxi to the runway, Aria glanced at Mark, who nodded reassuringly. He slipped her his business card, his expression earnest. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," he said quietly. "If you're interested in taking this further, I'd be happy to help." Aria held the card tightly, her mind racing. This was far from over. What had begun as a routine flight was rapidly transforming into something much bigger. A battle not just for her dignity, but for the countless others who had endured similar treatment. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She was a voice for change. The unseen battle begins. The plane ascended into the clouds, but Aria's thoughts remained grounded, spinning in a whirlwind of indignation and determination. She clenched Mark Reynolds' business card in her hand, the embossed letters practically cutting into her palm. His words resonated with her, echoing her own inner voice that demanded justice. This wasn't just about her. This was about every person who had been subtly or blatantly profiled and made to feel less than their worth. Settling back into her seat, Aria tried to focus on her presentation slides on her tablet. Yet, her concentration wavered. The incident replayed in her mind with startling clarity. The accusatory tone of the flight attendant, the skeptical looks of the crew, and the murmurs of the passengers as her dignity was questioned in front of everyone. Every moment felt like a wound that needed healing, but Aria knew healing wouldn't come from silence. It would come from action. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am." Aria looked up to see a woman standing in the aisle. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with sharp eyes and a determined expression. "I'm Elena Rodriguez." The woman introduced herself, lowering her voice. "I'm an investigative journalist. I couldn't help but overhear what happened earlier. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions? Off the record for now." Aria hesitated, sizing up Elena. The journalist's gaze was steady but not intrusive, and there was a sincerity in her tone that Aria found comforting. "I suppose it depends on the questions," Aria replied cautiously. Elena took the seat across the aisle, leaning closer. "I'm working on a series about systemic discrimination in public services," she explained. "Your situation is far too familiar. I've been gathering stories about similar incidents in the airline industry. If you're willing to share, I think your experience could add a powerful voice to the narrative." Aria blinked, surprised. "You mean this has happened to others?" Elena nodded grimly. "Far too often. People of color, women traveling alone, passengers who don't fit the stereotypical first-class profile. It's not always this overt, but the bias is there. The industry doesn't like to talk about it, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. Aria felt a mix of anger and validation. Her experience wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a larger pattern. "I'm not sure if I'm ready to go public," she admitted, "but I'd like to hear more about what you've uncovered." Elena nodded, understanding. "Of course. No pressure. But if you decide to share, I'm here." Before Elena could return to her seat, Mark Reynolds leaned over from across the aisle. "Ms. Rodriguez, I couldn't help but overhear," he said, his voice low but firm. "I've been collecting cases like this as well. I'm a civil rights attorney. If you're investigating this issue, we might have some stories to compare." Aria watched as the two exchanged contact information, a flicker of hope kindling in her chest. Perhaps this wasn't just her fight. Perhaps she had allies, people who understood the weight of what had happened and were willing to stand with her. As the flight continued, Aria began to notice a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The other passengers, many of whom had initially watched the confrontation with awkward silence, now seemed more openly supportive. A man a few rows ahead caught her eye and gave her a thumbs up. A woman across the aisle mouthed, "Good for you," when their eyes met. It was a small but meaningful acknowledgement that Aria wasn't alone. Meanwhile, the flight crew appeared increasingly uneasy. The lead attendant avoided her gaze entirely, and the regional manager, who had remained on board, seemed preoccupied with frantic whispers into her phone. Aria guessed the airline's legal and PR teams were already in damage control mode, trying to assess how much fallout this incident might generate. Her guess wasn't far off. In the crew galley, a heated conversation was unfolding between the regional manager and the flight attendants involved in the incident. "Do you realize what you've done?" the manager hissed. "This isn't just about a customer complaint. This could escalate into a lawsuit, or worse, a media scandal. We're already under scrutiny for other issues." The attendants exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence visibly shaken. "We were just following protocol," one of them muttered defensively. "Protocol doesn't include humiliating passengers based on assumptions," the manager snapped. "This is unacceptable." Aria, oblivious to the turmoil brewing behind the scenes, focused on drafting an email on her tablet. She wanted to document the incident while it was still fresh in her mind. Every word felt like a step toward reclaiming her agency, a way to turn her humiliation into a catalyst for change. Midway through the flight, another unexpected ally emerged. A young black woman seated near the rear of first class approached Aria with a shy smile. "Hi," she said softly. "I just wanted to say thank you for standing your ground. I've had similar experiences, and it's inspiring to see someone refuse to back down." Aria felt a lump form in her throat. "Thank you," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot to hear that." The woman hesitated, then added, "If you ever need support or a witness for what happened today, I'd be happy to help. My name's Jasmine." Aria smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Jasmine. I might just take you up on that." As Jasmine returned to her seat, Aria felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been made to feel less than. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all of them. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Aria's phone buzzed with a notification. She glanced at the screen and saw a flurry of messages and social media posts. To her astonishment, the incident had already begun to gain traction online. Passengers from the flight had shared their accounts of the confrontation, and the story was quickly picking up steam. One post stood out, a tweet from a passenger seated in economy class. "Saw a black woman get questioned in first class for no reason. She handled it with grace, but the airline? Not so much. This needs to stop. #racial profiling, #StandWithAria." The tweet had already been shared thousands of times, and the hashtag #StandWithAria was beginning to trend. Aria's heart raced. This was bigger than she had anticipated. The support was overwhelming, but so was the realization of what lay ahead. She was no longer just a corporate lawyer on a business trip. She was the face of a movement she hadn't asked to lead, but one she couldn't turn away from. As the plane touched down, Aria took a deep breath. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. With allies like Mark, Elena, and Jasmine by her side, she knew she wasn't alone. This wasn't just her story. It was a story for all those who had been silenced. The fight for justice had begun, and Aria Thompson was ready to see it through. The first step toward justice. The plane rolled to a stop at Los Angeles International Airport, the cabin filled with the usual sounds of passengers gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. But for Aria Thompson, the usual end-of-flight routine was anything but normal. As she gathered her bag, she couldn't shake the sensation that she was at the center of something much larger than herself. The messages and hashtags still buzzing on her phone were a clear signal that her experience had struck a nerve, and the story wasn't over. Mark Reynolds and Elena Rodriguez waited for her near the jet bridge. Their presence was a silent reassurance that Aria wasn't facing this battle alone. Mark had a protective, almost brotherly aura about him, while Elena's sharp eyes seemed to be cataloging every detail for her eventual story. "Ready?" Mark asked as Aria approached. His tone was casual, but there was an undercurrent of seriousness that she appreciated. "As ready as I'll ever be," Aria replied with a small smile. The trio stepped into the terminal, where Aria was immediately struck by the chaos awaiting them. Camera flashes lit up the space like strobe lights, and reporters jockeyed for position, shouting questions over one another. Aria froze for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of it all. "Miss Thompson, can you comment on the incident? Do you believe this was racial profiling? Will you be taking legal action against the airline?" Aria barely had time to process the barrage of questions before Mark stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Thompson will not be making a statement at this time," he announced, his tone firm and authoritative. "We'll issue a formal statement once we've had time to review the facts and determine the best course of action." The reporters didn't seem satisfied, but they backed off slightly, their attention now divided between Aria and the other passengers trickling out of the gate. As they moved through the terminal, Elena leaned in and whispered, "They're not going to stop, you know. This story is going to grow legs." Aria sighed. "I know. I just didn't expect it to happen this fast." By the time they reached baggage claim, Aria's phone was vibrating nonstop. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers were reaching out, offering words of support and encouragement. One message, in particular, caught her eye. It was from Jasmine, the young woman who had spoken to her on the plane. "Hey, Aria. Just wanted to let you know I've been sharing my side of the story on social media. People need to know what happened to you wasn't right. Let me know if there's anything else I can do to help." Aria's heart swelled with gratitude. The solidarity she was experiencing from total strangers was humbling. She typed a quick response thanking Jasmine and letting her know how much her support meant. Mark, meanwhile, was already in full attorney mode. "We need to strategize," he said as they exited the terminal. "This isn't just a PR issue, it's a legal one. If the airline's behavior today is indicative of a larger pattern, we could be looking at a class action lawsuit." Elena nodded in agreement. "And the public needs to hear about this. The more people who come forward with their own stories, the harder it'll be for the airline to sweep this under the rug." Aria listened, a mix of determination and trepidation brewing inside her. She wasn't a stranger to fighting battles. Her career in corporate law had prepared her for high-stakes situations. But this felt different. This was personal. Later that evening, Aria, Mark, and Elena convened at Aria's hotel room to discuss their next steps. The room was modest but comfortable, with a small table where they spread out their laptops and notebooks. Aria had changed into more casual clothes, but her professional demeanor remained intact. Elena was the first to speak. "Here's what we know so far," she began, pulling up a spreadsheet on her laptop. In the past 2 years, there have been at least a dozen reported incidents of racial profiling by this airline. Most of them didn't make the news, but I found records of formal complaints filed with the Department of Transportation. Mark leaned forward, his expression serious. And those are just the reported cases. For every complaint filed, there are probably dozens more incidents that went unreported. People often don't bother because they assume nothing will come of it. Arya frowned. How do we turn those numbers into action? Mark smiled faintly. That's where you come in. Your case is already getting attention. If you're willing to go public, it could inspire others to share their stories. That kind of momentum could lead to real change. Arya hesitated, her mind racing. Going public meant exposing herself to scrutiny and backlash. But it also meant shining a light on an issue that desperately needed addressing. I'll do it, she said finally, her voice steady. But only if we do it right. This can't just be about me. It has to be about everyone who's been affected. Elena nodded approvingly. That's exactly the approach we need. I'll start drafting an article. Mark, can you help me verify some of these complaints? Consider it done, Mark replied. And Arya, we'll need to document your experience in detail. Every word, every action, it all needs to be recorded. Arya nodded, already pulling out her laptop. Let's get to work. For the next few hours, the three of them worked tirelessly, piecing together the narrative and preparing for the inevitable media firestorm. Arya recounted the incident in painstaking detail, her words sharp and precise. Mark analyzed the airline's policies and practices, identifying potential legal vulnerabilities. And Elena began drafting a powerful exposé that would not only highlight Arya's experience, but also expose the systemic issues within the airline industry. By the time they wrapped up for the night, Arya felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't anticipated. The day had been harrowing, but it had also been transformative. She was no longer just reacting to the injustice she had faced. She was taking control, turning her pain into a platform for change. As she lay in bed that night, her mind refused to rest. Images of the day flashed through her thoughts. The flight attendant's skeptical gaze, Mark's defiant stand, the murmurs of support from passengers, and the blinding camera flashes at the airport. It was overwhelming, but it was also empowering. Arya knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be criticism, resistance, and moments of doubt, but as she drifted off to sleep, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had been marginalized, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. And Arya Thompson was ready to lead the charge. The storm breaks. The next morning, Arya woke up to the sound of her phone vibrating incessantly on the nightstand. The sunlight filtering through the hotel curtains signaled a new day, but the storm outside had already begun. She groggily reached for her phone and blinked at the screen, her notifications overflowing with messages, emails, and missed calls. Her story had gone viral overnight. Elena's preliminary article, though not yet published in full, had been picked up by social media. Passengers from Arya's flight had posted their own accounts, some even tagging the airline in public condemnation. The hashtag #StandWithArya was trending, and stories of similar experiences were flooding the internet. Arya sat up, her heart pounding. She scrolled through her notifications, reading messages of support, outrage, and solidarity. But amidst the flood of encouragement, there were also messages of criticism and vitriol, people accusing her of fabricating the incident or overreacting. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. She had anticipated backlash, but seeing it firsthand was another matter. Her phone buzzed again. It was Mark. "Good morning," he said briskly when she answered. "Have you seen the news?" "Barely," Arya replied, her voice still hoarse from sleep. "It's everywhere, isn't it?" "Everywhere," Mark confirmed. Elena's article is gaining traction, and several news outlets are picking it up. But more importantly, we've already received dozens of emails from people who've had similar experiences. I think we're onto something big here. Arya exhaled deeply. It's overwhelming. I know, Mark said gently, but you're handling it well. Elena and I are meeting with a few potential witnesses later today. You should join us. I'll be there, Aria promised. She ended the call and took a moment to compose herself before getting out of bed. This wasn't the day she had planned, but it was the day she had been given, and she intended to face it head-on. The meeting was held in a small conference room at a co-working space Elena had arranged. When Aria arrived, Mark and Elena were already there, along with two other individuals. One was a young black man in his late 20s, wearing a casual hoodie and jeans. The other was an older Latina woman with a warm but wary expression. Aria, meet Jordan and Maria, Elena said, gesturing to the two. They reached out after hearing about your story. Both of them have faced similar issues with the airline. Aria shook their hands, her lawyer's instincts kicking in as she assessed their demeanor. Both seemed genuine and eager to share their experiences. Jordan spoke first. I was flying to a tech conference last year, he began, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. I had upgraded to first class using my miles, but when I boarded, the attendant told me there must have been a mistake. They tried to send me back to economy, even after I showed them my confirmation. Maria nodded in understanding. For me, it was a business trip to Chicago, she said. I travel a lot for work, and I've always preferred the extra space in first class. But on this one flight, they questioned my ticket, my ID, everything. They only backed off when a white colleague vouched for me. Aria listened intently, taking notes on her tablet. The parallels between their stories and her own were striking. Thank you both for coming forward, she said sincerely. Your voices add weight to this issue. Mark leaned forward. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need to build a case, he said. If we can demonstrate a pattern of discriminatory practices, the airline will have to answer for it. Elena chimed in. And the media can amplify those voices. This isn't just about one incident. It's about systemic issues that need addressing. The meeting continued for over an hour, with Jordan and Maria providing detailed accounts of their experiences. By the time they left, Aria felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was a collective movement. Later that day, Aria received an email from the airline's legal team. The message was carefully worded, apologizing for the misunderstanding and offering her a full refund, free travel vouchers, and a vague promise to review their policies. Aria's jaw tightened as she read the email. It was a textbook example of corporate damage control, an attempt to buy her silence without addressing the root issue. She forwarded the email to Mark, who called her immediately. Do not respond to that, he said firmly. They're trying to sweep this under the rug. We need to keep the pressure on. I wasn't planning to, Aria assured him. I want accountability, not compensation. Good, Mark replied, because we're getting somewhere. I've already reached out to a few other attorneys who specialize in civil rights cases. If this turns into a class action suit, we'll need all the help we can get. Aria felt a surge of determination. I'm in, she said, whatever it takes. That evening, Elena published the full article. It was a powerful piece, combining Aria's story with the accounts of other passengers and broader data on racial profiling in the airline industry. The article quickly went viral, drawing attention from major news outlets and sparking debates across social media. As Aria read the article, she felt a mix of pride and apprehension. The words were raw and unflinching, laying bare the injustice she had faced, but they also painted her as a symbol of resilience and change, a role she hadn't sought but was willing to embrace. Her phone buzzed with a call from her mother. Aria, her mother said, her voice filled with equal parts concern and pride. I saw the article. Are you okay? I'm fine, Mom, Aria replied, though her voice wavered slightly. It's just a lot. I know, sweetheart, her mother said gently, but you've always been strong. And what you're doing, it matters. You're making a difference. Aria felt tears prick her eyes. Thanks, Mom. That means a lot. As she hung up, Aria felt a renewed sense of clarity. This wasn't about the airline's apology or even a lawsuit. It was about creating a ripple effect, challenging systemic issues, and paving the way for a more just future. She looked out the window of her hotel room, the city lights twinkling like a promise. The storm had broken, but the fight was far from over. Aria Thompson was ready for whatever came next. Turning the tide. The days that followed were a blur of interviews, strategy meetings, and an ever-growing wave of public support. Aria Thompson found herself in uncharted territory, no longer just a corporate lawyer on a mission to prove her worth in a boardroom, but a public figure thrust into the limelight of a national conversation. Her phone rang incessantly, reporters seeking comments, civil rights organizations offering support, and strangers thanking her for speaking up. Among the calls, there was one from a name she recognized immediately: Alicia Grant, a prominent civil rights advocate and founder of Voices for Justice, a nonprofit known for challenging corporate discrimination. "Aria, I've been following your story," Alicia said when Aria answered. Her tone was warm, but carried the weight of someone accustomed to battles. "What you're doing is important. I'd love to discuss how we can collaborate to amplify this issue." Aria felt a mix of awe and gratitude. Alicia Grant was a household name in activism circles, and her involvement would undoubtedly add credibility and visibility to the cause. "Thank you," Aria replied. "I'd be honored to work with you." "Let's start with a press conference," Alicia suggested. "We'll gather stories from others who faced similar discrimination and present a unified front. This isn't just your fight, it's ours." 2 days later, Aria stood at a podium in a packed conference room, flanked by Alicia, Mark, Alina, and several individuals who had come forward to share their experiences. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of outrage, solidarity, and hope. Cameras flashed as Aria adjusted the microphone, her heart pounding in her chest. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "My name is Aria Thompson, and I'm here not just as an individual who experienced discrimination, but as one of many who've been subjected to systemic bias in the airline industry." She paused, glancing at the faces in the room. What happened to me on that flight was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger problem. A culture of implicit bias that treats people differently based on their appearance, not their worth. Aria continued, weaving her personal story with the accounts of others who had come forward. She spoke about Jordan, Maria, and dozens more who had reached out, their voices forming a chorus of shared pain and resilience. As she spoke, the room grew quieter, the gravity of her words sinking in. "We're not here to point fingers without cause," Aria concluded. "We're here to demand accountability, transparency, and change. Because everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter where they're sitting on a plane or in life." The room erupted into applause as Aria stepped back from the podium. Alicia placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, whispering, "You did great." The press conference marked a turning point. The airline, now facing mounting pressure from the public, released a statement acknowledging the incident and promising an internal investigation. But Aria, Mark, and Alicia weren't satisfied with vague promises. They wanted concrete action, policy changes, mandatory diversity training, and public accountability. Behind the scenes, Mark was building a robust case. He had assembled a team of attorneys, combing through legal precedents and preparing for what could become a landmark lawsuit. Alina, meanwhile, was working on a follow-up piece, diving deeper into the systemic issues within the airline industry. Aria, though new to this level of advocacy, found herself rising to the challenge. Her background in corporate law gave her a unique perspective, allowing her to navigate the legal and media landscapes with precision. But it was more than just her skills. It was her resolve, fueled by the countless voices that had reached out to her, sharing their own stories of pain and perseverance. Amid the flurry of activity, Aria received an unexpected email. It was from one of the flight attendants involved in the incident. The message was brief but heartfelt. "Ms. Thompson, I wanted to apologize for my actions during the flight. I was wrong to question your presence in first class, and I deeply regret my behavior. This experience has been a wake-up call for me. I'm committed to educating myself and doing better. Thank you for standing up for what's right. The email left Aria conflicted. On one hand, it was a small victory, proof that her actions were making an impact. But on the other hand, it was a reminder of how deeply ingrained these biases were even in well-meaning individuals. She forwarded the email to Mark, who called her almost immediately. "This is interesting," he said. "It could be useful in demonstrating the systemic nature of the problem. But it's up to you how we proceed." Aria thought for a moment. "I don't want to vilify individuals," she said. "This isn't about punishing one person. It's about changing the system. Let's keep it in our back pocket for now." As the days turned into weeks, the movement gained momentum. #StandWithAria evolved into a broader campaign, with people from all walks of life sharing their stories of discrimination in travel, employment, and beyond. Alicia's nonprofit organized town halls and online forums, creating spaces for dialogue and action. The airline, facing boycotts and a growing PR crisis, announced a series of measures, including mandatory diversity training for employees and an independent review of its policies. But Aria, Mark, and Alicia weren't satisfied with surface-level solutions. They pushed for deeper, structural changes, knowing that real progress required more than just a few symbolic gestures. One evening, as Aria prepared for yet another media appearance, she received a call from her mentor, Mr. Whittaker. He had been her guiding light during her early years as a lawyer, and his voice carried the wisdom of decades of experience. "I'm proud of you, Aria," he said. "You've turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. But remember, the road ahead won't be easy." "I know," Aria replied. "But it's worth it." "It is," Mr. Whittaker agreed. "And remember, you're not alone. You've got a whole community behind you now." As Aria hung up, she felt a sense of clarity. The fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't just about her. It was about creating a future where no one would have to face the kind of discrimination she had experienced. The tide was turning, and Aria Thompson was determined to see it through. The ripple effect. Later that evening, Aria sat in her hotel room, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The press conference had been a success, and the momentum of the movement was undeniable. But as she sat in the quiet of her room, the weight of the journey ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders. Her phone buzzed with a video call request from Elena. Aria hesitated before answering, brushing her hair back and straightening her blouse. "Elena," she greeted, her tone lighter than she felt. "What's the latest?" Elena's face appeared on the screen, her sharp features softened by a rare smile. "I wanted to share this with you before it goes live." She turned her camera to show her laptop screen, where an email from her editor confirmed the publication of a follow-up article. The headline read, "From First Class to Frontlines, Aria Thompson and the Fight for Equality in Air Travel." Aria blinked, her heart racing. "Frontlines. That's what you are, Aria," Elena said. "You're leading the charge, whether you meant to or not." The article dives deeper into the systemic issues we've uncovered, but it also highlights the people behind the movement. You, Jordan, Maria, and everyone else who's come forward. Aria felt a lump in her throat. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It already has," Elena assured her. "But there's more. I got an anonymous tip from someone inside the airline. They claim the company has been quietly settling discrimination cases for years, ensuring the details never see the light of day." Aria's eyes widened. "Do you have proof?" "Not yet," Elena admitted. "But I'm following up. If it's true, this could blow the lid off the whole industry." The next morning, Aria met with Mark and Alicia in a conference room at a local legal aid center. Mark's team had compiled a growing list of complaints against the airline, while Alicia had mobilized grassroots support through her nonprofit. "Here's what we know," Mark began, projecting a document onto a screen. The airline has settled at least 22 discrimination cases in the past 5 years. The settlements include non-disclosure agreements, which is why none of this has come out until now. But we've identified a few former employees willing to speak off the record. Alicia leaned forward, her expression fierce. This isn't just about policy, it's about culture. If we're going to force change, we need to show the public the full extent of the problem. Aria nodded, her mind racing. How do we get them to talk on the record? If they're bound by NDAs, they might be too afraid to come forward. Mark smirked, a glint of mischief in his eyes. That's where legal strategy comes in. NDAs are powerful, but they're not bulletproof. If we can prove the airline used them to cover up illegal practices, the NDAs could be invalidated. As the day wore on, Aria found herself juggling multiple roles: lawyer, activist, and reluctant public figure. Each meeting, each call, and each new revelation added another layer to the growing movement. By late afternoon, she was exhausted but driven. She sat with Alicia in the nonprofit's headquarters, reviewing the latest influx of stories submitted by people across the country. One in particular caught her attention: a handwritten letter from an elderly black man named Harold. He recounted an incident from decades ago when he had been denied boarding on a flight despite holding a valid ticket. "I never spoke up," Harold wrote, "because I thought no one would listen. But now, seeing what you're doing, I realize it's never too late to fight for what's right." Aria felt tears prick her eyes as she read the letter aloud to Alicia. "This is why we're doing this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For people like Harold." That evening, Aria appeared on a major news program for a live interview. Dressed in a sleek black suit, she exuded calm confidence, though her hands trembled slightly beneath the desk. The host, a seasoned journalist, introduced her as the face of a growing movement against discrimination in air travel. "Miss Thompson," the host began, "your story has resonated with millions. What do you think makes it so powerful?" Aria paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think it's because it's not just my story. It's the story of countless people who've been treated unfairly, who've been judged by their appearance rather than their character. My experience is just one example of a much larger issue that needs addressing." The host nodded. "The airline has issued an apology and promised an internal investigation. Do you think that's enough?" "No," Aria said firmly. "An apology is a start, but it's not enough. We need transparency. We need accountability. And we need systemic change to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The host leaned forward. "What would you say to those who criticize you, who claim you're making too much of this incident?" Aria met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "I'd say that standing up for what's right is never too much. If we ignore these issues, we allow them to continue. I won't apologize for demanding fairness and respect. Not for myself, and not for anyone else." The interview ended to a round of applause from the studio audience, and Aria left the set feeling both exhilarated and drained. She knew the fight was far from over, but moments like this reminded her why it was worth it. As Aria returned to her hotel that night, she reflected on the whirlwind of events that had brought her to this point. The incident on the plane felt like a lifetime ago, but its impact had only just begun to unfold. She thought of Harold's letter, of Jordan and Maria, and of the countless others who had shared their stories. This fight wasn't just about her, it was about all of them. And Aria Thompson was determined to see it through to the end, no matter how long it took. A movement takes flight. The morning began with a jolt. Aria awoke to a flood of notifications, emails, social media messages, and missed calls from both supporters and detractors. Overnight, the airline's internal policies had been leaked to the press, revealing a history of discriminatory practices thinly veiled under the guise of security protocol. The documents, obtained by an anonymous whistleblower, detailed instances where employees were encouraged to question passengers who didn't fit the profile of first-class clientele. The revelation sent shockwaves through the media. News outlets dissected the documents, social media erupted in outrage, and hashtags like hashtag systemic bias and hashtag Change the Airlines trended globally. For Area, it was a bittersweet vindication. Mark Reynolds, Area's civil rights attorney and steadfast ally, called her early that morning. His voice carried a mix of excitement and caution. "This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for," he said. "The documents confirm what we've been arguing all along. This isn't just about isolated incidents. It's a systemic problem." Area rubbed her temples, still groggy from lack of sleep. "But how do we turn this into action? Public outrage isn't enough. We need real, tangible change." Mark's tone shifted, becoming more strategic. "We've got a team of attorneys reviewing the documents now. This is the evidence we need to build a solid case. But we'll also need to keep the public engaged. This isn't just a legal battle, it's a cultural one." Later that day, Area attended a town hall organized by Alicia Grant's nonprofit, Voices for Justice. The event was held in a community center in downtown Los Angeles, packed with people of all ages and backgrounds. The air buzzed with anticipation as Area took the stage, flanked by Alicia, Mark, and a panel of others who had come forward to share their stories. The moderator introduced Area with a rousing endorsement, calling her a symbol of resilience and a voice for change. Area stepped up to the microphone, her heart pounding, but her resolve firm. "Good evening," she began, scanning the room. "Thank you all for being here. Tonight isn't about me. It's about us. It's about the countless people who've experienced injustice, who've been made to feel like they don't belong. Together, we're saying enough is enough." The crowd erupted into applause. Area continued, sharing her story and weaving it into the broader narrative of systemic discrimination. She emphasized the importance of collective action, urging everyone in the room to stand together in the fight for equality. As Area spoke, she noticed a young girl in the front row, no more than 10 years old, watching her with wide, curious eyes. After the event, the girl approached Area with her mother, who introduced her as Sophia. "Miss Thompson," Sophia said shyly, "I just wanted to say you're really brave. I want to be like you when I grow up." Area knelt to meet Sophia's gaze, her heart swelling. "Thank you, Sophia," she said gently. "You can be anything you want to be. And you're already braver than you know." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The leaked documents had not only strengthened Area's case, but also galvanized a growing movement. Public pressure mounted on the airline, with calls for boycotts and protests gaining traction. Activists organized demonstrations at major airports, demanding accountability and change. Meanwhile, Area and Mark worked tirelessly to prepare their legal case. They interviewed witnesses, gathered statements, and collaborated with other attorneys to build a class action lawsuit. The process was grueling, but Area's determination never wavered. One evening, while reviewing documents in her hotel room, Area received an email that stopped her cold. It was from the airline's CEO, a man who had remained notably silent throughout the controversy. The email was direct but carefully worded. "Dear Ms. Thompson, I am writing to personally apologize for the treatment you experienced on our flight. As CEO, I take full responsibility for the shortcomings of our organization. We are committed to making significant changes to ensure such incidents never occur again. I would like to meet with you in person to discuss how we can move forward constructively. Please let me know if you are open to this conversation. Sincerely, Edward Callahan." Area forwarded the email to Mark immediately. He called her within minutes. "Well, this is interesting," he said. "They're feeling the heat. A public apology from the CEO is a big deal. But is it genuine?" Area asked skeptically, "Or just damage control?" "Probably both," Mark admitted. "But this could be an opportunity. If you meet with him, you could push for meaningful changes. Real policy reforms, not just PR stunts." Area hesitated. The thought of sitting across from the man who presided over the company that had humiliated her was daunting. But she also saw the potential for progress. "Let's do it," she said finally. "But I want to be prepared. No empty promises." The meeting was scheduled for the following week, held in a sleek conference room at the airline's corporate headquarters. Aria arrived with Mark by her side, her confidence bolstered by the knowledge that she wasn't alone in this fight. Edward Callahan greeted them with a firm handshake and a practiced smile. He was a tall man in his late 50s, his demeanor polished but cautious. "Miss Thompson, thank you for coming," he said. "I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you." The conversation began with Callahan reiterating his apology and outlining the company's proposed changes, including diversity training for employees and the establishment of a task force to address bias in their policies. But Aria wasn't satisfied with vague commitments. "With all due respect, Mr. Callahan," she said, her tone firm, "these measures are a start, but they're not enough. Your company needs to commit to full transparency, including the release of historical data on complaints and settlements. And any changes you implement must be measurable and publicly accountable." Mark chimed in, outlining additional demands, including independent oversight and a timeline for implementing the reforms. Callahan listened intently, occasionally nodding, but his expression remained guarded. "We'll consider your proposals," he said finally. "But I want to assure you, Ms. Thompson, that we are taking this issue seriously." Aria met his gaze evenly. "I hope you are, Mr. Callahan, because this isn't just about your company. It's about setting a standard for the entire industry." As Aria left the meeting, she felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. The fight was far from over, but progress had been made. The movement she had unintentionally sparked was now a force to be reckoned with, and Aria was more committed than ever to seeing it through. Back at her hotel, Aria reflected on how far she had come since that fateful flight. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had transformed into a rallying cry for justice, not just for her, but for countless others. As she looked out at the city lights, Aria knew the road ahead would be challenging. But she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Together, they were turning pain into power and creating a future where dignity and equality would no longer be negotiable.